Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move behind the public barricade. This area is for participants and distinguished guests only. The voice was polite, professional, but carried the unyielding edge of someone managing a tightly scheduled event. Caroline Gable, clipboard in hand, offered a thin, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was looking at the old man who stood near the edge of the reserved seating, his back to the gleaming black granite of the new K9 War Dog Memorial. He didn't look like a distinguished guest. He looked like he'd just come from mucking out a barn. His canvas jacket was faded to the color of a dusty road, patched at the elbows with a darker, sturdier material. His boots were scuffed and caked with dry mud around the welts, and his hands, clasped loosely in front of him, were gnarled and thick-knuckled, the skin cross-hatched with a lifetime of labor. He simply stood there, a solitary, weathered stone amidst the manicured lawn and crisp military uniforms, his gaze fixed on the empty stage. He turned his head slowly, his movements economical, no wasted energy. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, met hers. They weren't defiant or confused. They were just calm, unsettlingly calm. "I'm just watching," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a creek. "I understand," Carolyn replied, her smile tightening. "But the ceremony is about to begin, and we need to clear this space. The governor's security detail will be sweeping through. You can get a perfectly good view from over there." She gestured with her pen toward the white rope line where a small crowd was gathering. The man didn't look where she was pointing. His attention had drifted back to the memorial wall, where the names of fallen K9s were etched in sharp silver letters. He ran a thumb over the back of his other hand, a slow, contemplative gesture. He didn't seem angry or offended by her dismissal. He just seemed patient, as if he were waiting for something she couldn't see. This quiet non-compliance was more frustrating to Caroline than an argument would have been. She had 100 details to manage, a senator running late, and a catering issue that was threatening to become a full-blown crisis. She didn't have time for a stubborn old farmer who'd wandered onto the grounds. A few yards away, Corporal Ben Carter stood with his partner Rex, a magnificent Belgian Malinois whose sable coat gleamed in the overcast morning light. Rex sat at a perfect rigid heel, his attention fixed on Carter, but his ears twitched, cataloging every sound: the rustle of Caroline's papers, the distant hum of traffic, the soft sigh of the wind through the massive oak trees that bordered the memorial park. Carter watched the exchange between the event planner and the old man. He'd noticed the farmer earlier. Anyone with his training would have. It wasn't what the man was wearing, but how he was wearing it. He stood with his weight perfectly balanced, his shoulders relaxed but aligned, a posture that spoke not of military bearing in the parade ground sense, but of a deep, ingrained physical discipline. It was a posture of readiness, of profound awareness that seemed utterly at odds with his civilian clothes and advanced age. Carter had seen old men stand. His own grandfather, a retired plumber, stooped and leaned, his body a testament to decades spent in crawl spaces. This was different. This man stood like he was rooted to the earth, yet could move with explosive speed if he had to. Carter's eyes were drawn to the man's hands again. They were farmer's hands, yes, but there was a faint silvery network of old scars across the knuckles, and a particular type of thickened callus along the edge of his palms that Carter had only ever seen on one other person. His first training sergeant, a man who had spent 30 years working with the most difficult dogs in the program. He watched as the old man finally gave a slow, deliberate nod to Ms. Gable. He didn't shuffle away. He took 2 precise gliding steps back, placing himself just outside the VIP seating area, but not behind the public barricade. He was now partially obscured by the thick trunk of a centennial oak, a silent observer who had conceded the letter of the law but not the spirit of his vigil. Caroline Gable, seeing movement and assuming compliance, gave a curt nod and hurried away, her focus already on the next item on her checklist. She had dismissed him, filed him away as a non-issue. Carter knew, with a certainty that prickled the back of his neck, that she had just made a profound mistake. Rex let out a low, almost inaudible whine, his gaze shifting for a split second towards the old man before locking back onto Carter. It was nothing, a momentary lapse, but for a dog as disciplined as Rex, it was the equivalent of a shout. Carter placed a reassuring hand on his partner's head, but his own eyes remained fixed on the quiet figure under the oak tree. The ceremony began with the requisite pomp and circumstance. A local high school band played a slightly off-key rendition of the national anthem. A series of local dignitaries and mid-level military brass took to the podium. They spoke in well-meaning but generic platitudes about courage, loyalty, and the ultimate sacrifice. They used words like asset, equipment, and force multiplier to describe the dogs whose names were carved into the stone behind them. Caroline Gable stood at the side of the stage, nodding at the appropriate moments, her eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring everything was proceeding according to her meticulously planned schedule. Her gaze flickered past the old farmer several times, a brief flash of annoyance each time. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, his weathered face impassive, his pale eyes watching the speakers without expression. To her, he was a smudge on a perfect photograph, a discordant note in a carefully composed symphony. She made a mental note to have security escort him out if he made any move to disrupt the proceedings. Corporal Carter, standing in formation with 6 other K-9 handlers and their partners, listened to the speeches with half an ear. He'd heard them all before. His focus was split between maintaining Rex's perfect composure and observing the old man. He was a student of details. His profession demanded it. He noticed the way the man didn't scan the crowd, but instead seemed to track the movement of the wind through the trees. He saw how the man's breathing was slow and deep, a controlled, meditative rhythm that didn't change even when a car backfired on the nearby street, causing half the audience to jump. It was the composure of a man who had mastered his own reactions, who had faced down things far more startling than a backfiring engine. Carter thought about the stories he'd heard at the kennels, whispered legends of the old-timers, the pioneers from the Vietnam era who wrote the book on training dogs for war. They were a different breed, men who understood the canine mind in a way that felt more like art than science. They were all gone now, retired or passed away, their names fading from memory, their techniques refined and sanitized into modern training manuals. The keynote speaker was a 2-star general, a logistics officer who had likely never spent a day in the field with a working dog. He spoke eloquently about the unbreakable bond between handler and K-9, but his words lacked the grit and weight of experience. He was reciting a script. Carter felt a familiar surge of frustration. People saw the highlight reels, the heroic captures, the stoic memorial photos. They didn't see the endless hours in the rain, the painstaking work of building trust, the terror of sending your partner into a dark room ahead of you, or the soul-crushing grief when they didn't come back out. He glanced over at the old farmer again. For the first time, he saw a flicker of emotion on the man's face. As the general spoke of a dog named Storm, killed in Afghanistan, the old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His eyes closed for a brief moment, a silent communion with a memory Carter couldn't access. When they opened again, they seemed older, sadder, carrying a weight that the general's polished speech could never touch. It was in that moment Carter knew the man wasn't just a spectator. He was a mourner. He was connected to this place, to these names, in a way no one else here was. The general finished his speech to polite applause. Caroline Gable stepped to the microphone, her voice crisp and clear. And now, for the laying of the wreaths, we are honored to have with us today 7 of our finest active-duty K-9 teams from the 14th Military Police Brigade. She gestured towards Carter and the other handlers. They will now come forward to pay tribute to their fallen brethren. This was the emotional peak of the ceremony, the moment she had choreographed for maximum impact. The handlers, in perfect unison, executed a crisp facing movement and began to walk in a slow, solemn procession toward the memorial wall. 7 handlers, 7 dogs, moving as one. Rex was at Carter's side, his gait fluid and powerful. To his left was a stoic German shepherd named Valor. To his right, a nimble Dutch shepherd named Jinx. Behind them were 4 more, each a perfect specimen of their breed, each a highly trained and disciplined soldier. They were the living legacy of the names on the wall. The crowd fell silent, phones raised to capture the moment. The only sounds were the soft tread of boots on the grass and the faint jingle of dog tags. They approached the center of the memorial, their designated spots marked by small, discreet chalk lines on the pavement. The plan was simple. Halt, command the dogs to sit, lay the wreaths, a moment of silence, and then an orderly exit. They had rehearsed it 3 times. It was foolproof. But war, and the creatures of war, are never foolproof. They were about 20 feet from the memorial when it started. It began with Valor, the German shepherd. The dog, known for his ironclad discipline, suddenly stopped. He lowered his head, his nose twitching, and let out a high, searching whine. His handler, a seasoned staff sergeant named Riggs, gave a short, sharp tug on the leash. "Valor, heel!" The command was ignored. Valor's head came up, his ears swiveling, and his dark eyes scanned past the memorial, past the stage, and locked onto the figure standing under the oak tree. Then, Jinx, the Dutch shepherd, broke. She didn't stop. She began to pull, her powerful body straining against her collar, her tail giving a series of short, frantic wags. She wasn't being aggressive. It was a gesture of intense, desperate recognition. Within seconds, it was a chain reaction. Rex, at Carter's side, began to shiver, his entire body vibrating with a sudden, inexplicable energy. He whined, a deep guttural sound of confusion and yearning, and his eyes, too, found the old farmer. Carter felt the leash go taut in his hand. He looked down the line. All 7 dogs, from the sleek Malinois to the blocky-headed Labrador Retriever at the end, had lost their composure. They were all pulling, whining, their focus completely singular. They were all trying to get to the old man. The solemn procession had dissolved into chaos. The handlers, embarrassed and confused, fought to control their partners. "Heel! Sit! Watch me!" The commands were sharp, authoritative, but the dogs were deaf to them. Their training, their discipline, years of it, had vanished in an instant, overridden by a more primal, more powerful instinct. The crowd began to murmur, a wave of confusion rippling through the attendees. Caroline Gable's face was a mask of pure horror. Her perfect ceremony was unraveling. This was a disaster. Her eyes darted around, looking for a cause, a reason for this unprecedented breakdown of discipline. And her gaze landed with dawning fury on the old farmer. He was the anomaly. He was the disruption. He must have done something, made a sound, used a dog whistle, something to agitate them. She started forward, her face set in a hard line, ready to unleash a torrent of angry words to have him physically removed. "You, sir," she began, her voice shaking with rage. "You need to leave right now. You are disrupting a military ceremony." But before she could take another step, a hand fell on her arm. It was Corporal Carter. He hadn't moved to restrain Rex. He was holding the leash loosely, his expression one of stunned, dawning revelation. His eyes were wide, and he was staring at the old man not with suspicion, but with a look of utter, profound awe. "Ma'am, stop," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't." "What do you mean, don't?" she hissed, trying to pull her arm away. "Look at what he's done." "He hasn't done anything," Carter said, his gaze still fixed on the man under the tree. The old farmer hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched at the chaos. He simply stood there, watching the dogs, and for the first time, his impassive mask had broken. On his face was an expression of immense heartbreaking sorrow and a deep, abiding love. "Look at them," Carter whispered, nodding towards the frantic K9S. "They're not aggressive. They're not scared. They're trying to report for duty." The phrase hung in the air, nonsensical to Caroline, but to a handler, it was everything. It was the ultimate expression of a dog's purpose. The commotion had not gone unnoticed on the stage. The 2-star general looked flustered, unsure how to handle a situation so far outside the bounds of protocol. But another man, a full-bird colonel named Hayes, who had been sitting in the front row, was now on his feet. Hayes was an old-school special forces operator, a man who had come up through the ranks when the K9 program was still considered a fringe experiment. He had seen the impossible. His eyes narrowed, and he looked from the dogs to the old farmer, a flicker of disbelief, then recognition, dawning on his face. He ignored Caroline completely and strode purposefully across the grass, his boots making no sound. He walked straight up to the old man, stopping a respectful 2 feet away. The murmuring crowd fell silent, watching. Colonel Hayes did not speak for a long moment. He simply looked at the man, his eyes tracing the lines on the weathered face, the set of his shoulders, the quiet dignity of his stance. The old farmer met his gaze, his pale blue eyes clear and steady. The 7 dogs had fallen silent, their frantic pulling replaced by a tense, whining anticipation. "It is you," the colonel said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden stillness. "I thought you'd passed on years ago." The old farmer gave a slight, sad smile. "Not yet, Colonel. Just faded." "Faded is right," Hayes breathed, shaking his head in wonder. "No one even knew you were here." He then turned to face the confused assembly of handlers, dignitaries, and guests. His voice, when he spoke again, was no longer quiet. It boomed with the authority of a man accustomed to command, a voice that could cut through the noise of battle. "Handlers, stand easy. Let them go." There was a moment of shocked hesitation. Let them go? In the middle of a ceremony, with the governor and a senator in attendance? It was unthinkable. Staff Sergeant Riggs looked at the colonel, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Sir?" "You heard me, Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice like iron. "That's an order. Drop the leashes." Slowly, reluctantly, 7 leashes were unclipped. 7 handlers braced for a chaotic rush. But it didn't happen. The moment they were free, the 7 dogs did not bolt. They moved with a singular purpose, trotting forward as a group, their movements fluid and controlled. They flowed around the memorial, past the wreaths lying on the ground, and straight to the old man under the tree. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Caroline Gable put a hand to her mouth, her anger forgotten, replaced by sheer astonishment. The dogs didn't jump or bark. As they reached the farmer, they slowed, and one by one, they lay down at his feet. They pressed against his legs, rested their heads on his muddy boots, and looked up at him with expressions of absolute devotion. The great, powerful animals, the soldiers, the weapons, had become puppies again, seeking comfort and affirmation from their master. The old man's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He knelt, his old knees cracking in protest, and laid his scarred, gentle hands on the heads of the dogs nearest him. "Hello, boys," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, girls. I remember your grandfathers. I remember them all." Colonel Hayes turned back to the stunned audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice ringing with a fierce protective pride. "You're wondering what you just saw. You're wondering who this man is, this man our finest K9S chose to honor over all of us. I'll tell you. You've spent the last hour listening to speeches about the legacy of the military working dog program. Well, you're looking at the man who built it." He pointed a finger at the kneeling farmer. "That is Master Sergeant Gideon Black, retired. And for those of you who don't know the name, you should. Every training protocol you use, every bonding exercise, every scent imprinting technique that keeps our soldiers safe, it came from him. He wrote the book. Hell, he was the book." A wave of shock and understanding washed over the crowd. The name Gideon Black wasn't in the official histories. He was from a time of classified programs and quiet pioneers, a name spoken only in whispers by the old guard. He was a ghost, a legend. In the early 70s, the colonel continued, his voice resonating with history, when this program was on the verge of being scrapped, Gideon Black single-handedly saved it. He went to the jungles, to the most unforgiving places on Earth, and he developed a new way of training. He didn't break dogs, he partnered with them. He understood their hearts, their minds. He created a bond so deep it bordered on telepathic. The 7 dogs at his feet right now, they are not random. They represent the 7 primary bloodlines he personally established for the modern program. The Shepherd, the Malinois, the Labrador. He chose their ancestors. He shaped them. The colonel paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. They don't know him. They've never seen him before. But they know his legacy. It's in their bones. It's in their blood. Maybe they smell something on him, the scent of the old kennels, a place their great-great-grandsires called home. Or maybe, the colonel's voice softened, maybe they just recognize the presence of their alpha, their true master. He turned back to Gideon, who was now murmuring softly to Rex, his rough thumb stroking behind the dog's ears. The animal was utterly placid, leaning into the touch with a look of pure bliss. Corporal Carter stood frozen, watching the scene, tears welling in his eyes. He was in the presence of greatness, a living monument far more sacred than the polished stone behind him. Every success he'd ever had with Rex, every life saved, every mission accomplished, he owed in some way to this quiet, unassuming farmer. Caroline Gable felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, so intense it felt like a physical burn. Her meticulously planned event, her distinguished guests, her perfect optics, they were all meaningless. She had been so focused on the performance of respect that she had failed to see the genuine article standing right in front of her. She had mistaken a king for a pauper. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, her clipboard hanging limply at her side. She stopped beside Colonel Hayes, her eyes on the incredible tableau before her, the old man, the legend, surrounded by his living legacy, all of them oblivious to the crowd, lost in their own silent world of reunion. "Sir," she began, her voice small, humbled, "Master Sergeant Black, I'm so sorry." Gideon didn't look up immediately. He gave Valor's head one last firm pat before slowly, painfully pushing himself back to his feet. He looked at her, and his pale blue eyes held no anger, no triumph, no, "I told you so." There was only a gentle, weary understanding. "Nothing to be sorry for, ma'am," he said, his voice calm. "You were just doing your job, keeping things orderly." He looked around at the manicured lawns, the polished granite, the flags snapping in the breeze. "It's a nice place, a good place for them to be remembered. That's all that matters." His gaze then fell on Corporal Carter, who was still standing rigidly, as if on parade. Gideon's expression softened. "You, son, what's your partner's name?" Carter swallowed hard, finding his voice. "Rex, Master Sergeant. His designation is M477. Gideon nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. "M-Series. From Chaos's line. I can see it in his eyes. That fire." He took a step towards them, and Rex, without a command from Carter, sat up, his tail thumping a soft rhythm on the grass. Gideon reached out, not to pet the dog, but to take the young corporal's hand. Gideon's grip was surprisingly strong, his calloused skin like old leather. "You have good hands," he said quietly, looking Carter in the eye. "You're patient with him. He trusts you. That's the whole secret, you know. Everything else is just noise. It all comes down to trust." "Sir," Carter said, his voice choked with emotion, "it's an honor. We all studied your work at the academy, the Black Papers, we called them. But they were all attributed to a research group. They never told us your name." "A name isn't important," Gideon said, releasing his hand. "The work is. The dogs are. Make sure you remember that." He then turned and walked back to the circle of dogs who watched his every move. He knelt again, this time with less protest from his joints, and began to speak to them, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. He was pointing at the memorial wall, then murmuring to the German Shepherd, then running a hand down the back of the Labrador. He was telling them stories. He was introducing them to their ancestors. The handlers, led by Sergeant Riggs, slowly walked forward and stood in a loose circle around their dogs, not as guards, but as students, watching a master at work. The ceremony was forgotten. The dignitaries, the speeches, the schedule, it had all evaporated, replaced by this one pure, authentic moment of connection. The governor and the senator stood on the stage, their expressions unreadable, watching a quiet farmer command more respect and authority than their titles ever could. Caroline Gable stood beside Colonel Hayes, tears silently streaming down her face. She was witnessing the heart of service, the truth that lay beneath all the pomp and protocol she held so dear. It wasn't about the polished stone or the eloquent speeches. It was about a man with muddy boots and scarred hands, and the unconditional love of the creatures he had dedicated his life to. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, Gideon pushed himself to his feet one last time. He gave each dog a final lingering touch. "Go on now," he whispered. "Back to your partners. They need you." As if a spell had been broken, the dogs seemed to shake themselves, looking back at their handlers. One by one, they trotted back, nuzzling into their partner's legs, their duty reasserted. The handlers clipped the leashes back on, their movements full of a new reverence. Carter knelt and hugged Rex, burying his face in the dog's thick fur, overwhelmed by the history he had just touched. When he looked up, Gideon Black was gone. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't waited for thanks or accolades. He had simply melted back into the shadows of the old oak trees and vanished, leaving behind nothing but the muddy prints of his boots on the perfect lawn and a silence filled with a new, profound understanding. The ceremony was over, but the true tribute had just been paid. Colonel Hayes walked over to the memorial wall and gently touched one of the names etched there. Chaos, he read softly. Then he looked at Carter. You see, Corporal, legends never really die. They just find new ways to answer the call. The crowd began to disperse, not with the cheerful chatter of a finished event, but with a quiet, contemplative air. They had come to see a monument of stone and steel, and had instead been shown a monument of flesh and blood, a quiet old farmer who carried the soul of a service in his gnarled hands.